to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in just a moment. We're reading this morning from the 10th canto, continuing with the 10th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the second chapter. And today we'll be looking at the 27th verse. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this verse reads, Ekayanoso dvipalastrimulas Chaturasaha panchavidhusad atma Sapta tvag ashta vitapo navaksho Dasha chadi dvi khagohi adi vrikshaha. We'll read the translation. This translation is almost like a purport unto itself. So it's very interesting. This particular verse it's one of the most poetic verses and references we find in the Bhagavatam. And when I say poetic, what I mean to say is, of course, the entire Bhagavatam is poetry, but this particular verse is really interesting in that these phrases are used which actually need to be unpacked because there's an allegory or a metaphor that's being offered here, as we'll soon see. And so in the translation, Srila Prabhupada unpacks the metaphor. So it's a much longer translation in one sense than the verse itself, because the words of the verse itself are tightly packed up, but the point is to unpack them and to understand the meaning behind the allegory or the metaphor that's being used. So we will read through the translation, we'll read through the purport, and then we'll have some discussion and do some more unpacking. So this is the translation. The body, the total body and the individual body are of the same composition, may figuratively be called the original tree. From this tree, which fully depends on the ground of material nature, come two kinds of fruit, the enjoyment of happiness and the suffering of distress. The cause of the tree, forming its three roots, is association with the three modes of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. The fruits of bodily happiness have four tastes: religiosity, economic development, sense gratification, and liberation, which are experienced through five senses for acquiring knowledge in the midst of six circumstances: lamentation, illusion, old age, death, hunger, and thirst. The 7 layers of bark covering the tree are skin, blood, muscle, fat, bone, marrow, and semen. And the 8 branches of the tree are the 5 gross and 3 subtle elements. That is, earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. The tree of the body has 9 hollows: the eyes, the ears, the nostrils, the mouth, the rectum, and the genitals, and 10 leaves, the 10 airs passing through the body. In this tree of the body, there are 2 birds. One is the individual soul, and the other is the super soul. Srila Prabhupada's purport. This material world is composed of 5 principal elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, all of which are emanations from Krishna. Although materialistic scientists may accept these 5 primary elements as the cause of the material manifestation, these elements in their gross and subtle states are produced by Krishna, whose marginal potency also produces the living entities working within the material world. The 7th chapter of Bhagavad Gita clearly states that the entire cosmic manifestation is a combination of these two of Krishna's energies, the superior energy and the inferior energy. The living entities are the superior energy, and the inanimate material elements are his inferior energy. In the dormant stage, everything rests in Krishna. Material scientists cannot give such a thorough analysis of the material structure of the body. The analysis of the material scientist concerns itself only with inanimate matter, but this is inadequate because the living entity is completely separate from the material bodily structure. In Bhagavad Gita 7.5, the Lord says, Apareyam itastvanyam tvanyam prakritim vidhi me param jiva bhutam mahabaho yayedam dharyate jagat. Besides this inferior nature, O mighty armed Arjuna, there is a superior energy of mind, which consists of all the living entities who are struggling with material nature and are sustaining the universe. Although the material elements emanate from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, they are separated elements and are sustained by the living elements. As indicated by the word dvi-khaga, the living elements within the body resemble two birds in a tree. Ka means sky, and ga means one who flies. Thus, the word dvi-khaga refers to birds. In the tree of the body, there are two birds, or two living elements, and they are always different. In Bhagavad Gita 13.3, the Lord says, Kshetragyam chapi mam vidhi sarva kshetreshu bharataha. O sign of Bharat, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies. The Kshetragya, the owner of the body, is also called the Khaga, the living entity. Within the body, there are two such Kshetragyas, the individual soul and the supersoul. The individual soul is the owner of his individual body, but the supersoul is present within the bodies of all living entities. Such a thorough analysis and understanding of the bodily structure cannot be obtained anywhere but in the Vedic literature. When two birds enter a tree, one may foolishly think that the birds become one or merge with the tree, but actually they do not. Rather, each bird keeps its individual identity. Similarly, the individual soul and the supersoul do not become one, nor do they merge with matter. The living entity lives close to matter, but this does not mean that he merges or mixes with it. Asango hi ayam purushaha. Although material scientists mistakenly see the organic and inorganic, or animate and inanimate, to be mixed. Vedic knowledge has been kept imprisoned or concealed, but every human being needs to understand it in truth. The modern civilization of ignorance is simply engaged in analyzing the body, and thus people come to the erroneous conclusion that the living force within the body is generated under certain material conditions. People have no information of the soul, but this verse gives the perfect explanation that there are two living forces, dvi-khaga, the individual soul and the supersoul. The supersoul is present in every body. Ishvara sarva bhutanam hriddeshe arjuna tishtati. Whereas the individual soul is situated only in his own body, dehi, and is transmigrating from one body to another. So I won't read the translation again because it's quite long, but we will, in our discussion, return to it and go kind of part by part or piece by piece to try to understand what this verse is suggesting to us. Om Agyantimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Shvapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utpadakamanam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajataham Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Brindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Pancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So I thought it might make sense to go back to the verse and again, take our time unpacking what's being suggested here. And what I'd like to do this morning, actually, what I'm going to do is very quickly, I'm going to plug in my laptop. So give me 1 second, make sure I don't lose power. Okay, that's better. What I'd like to do this morning is go through the verse so we can understand each piece of the, it's not quite an analogy, maybe it's better to say a metaphor, kind of an extended metaphor that's being given. Let's try to really understand each piece of that metaphor, but let's also try to understand how it all fits together and what a verse like this is doing in the 10th canto, right? We're in the 10th canto, those of you who have been following along. And so 9 full cantos filled with deep philosophy, filled with lila, pastime, filled with story after story of the Lord in various forms, protecting his devotees, making himself accessible, and engaging in loving pastimes, chastising or vanquishing the wicked and the demoniac, right? So many stories. And now we come to the 10th canto where Shukadev Goswami is really concentrating and going to concentrate on sharing with Parikshit Maharaj the Lord's sweetest pastimes, right? The 10th canto, I believe, is compared to Lord Krishna's smile. So really, very deep esoteric subject matter that's really full of sweetness. And so it might be helpful to kind of get a little bit of perspective. When we see a verse like this, we might think, well, this seems really kind of technical and maybe even a little dry. What is it doing in the 10th canto? What does this have to do with? How is this preparing our consciousness or helping us to dive into not just Krishna's pastimes in the form of so many different avatars and manifestations, but Krishna's very own personal, most confidential pastimes in Vrajabhumi, Vrindavan. So I want to suggest that there's some takeaways here from this verse that if we can pluck them out, they put us in a very good position to really appreciate Krishna's sweetness and to really prepare our minds and our consciousness for the appearance of Krishna that is to come in this canto, and then of course all of his really charming pastimes. So the verse begins by using this phrase, Eka Ayanaha. And Eka Ayanaha here, it's a little mysterious, but it refers here to the body, which can be understood to be one tree. So there's something, there's a really nice poetic device that's being used in this verse where there's a counting that's going on. You may have noticed this already when we were reading the translation together. So we start with one. So one what? One tree. In other words, this body, this one lifetime, this one embodied kind of mind-body construct, we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, can be compared to a tree, whereas Srila Prabhupada translates here, the original tree. So this body is compared to a tree, one tree. So where does this one tree, where is it rooted? This tree is rooted in Prakriti, in material nature. We are, according to Vedanta philosophy and Sankhya philosophy, according to the philosophy of the Upanishads and the Gita, we are of the same nature as Krishna. Just as Krishna's nature is Satchidananda, our nature is also Satchidananda. Just as Krishna is sometimes called Purusha, we are also sometimes called Purusha. Of course, Krishna is Purushottama, the Uttama, the highest, the supreme person. So Purusha means person, or one translation of Purusha is person. So Krishna is Purushottama, the supreme person. We are Purusha. But what this means is we are actually personal. Purusha is also used as a synonym for Atman. So another thing we can say is we are Atma, right? Or if we want to use the English translation, as we so often say in our community, it's kind of become part of our vocabulary now. We are not these bodies. We are spirit, soul. So this phrase spirit, soul is a wonderful sort of translation for Atma, which is a little bit different than the sort of Western or Christian notion of a soul. Sometimes it's also called the self, the true self. So spirit, soul ends up being a nice kind of way of encapsulating that. So if we're spirit, soul, and we're not these bodies, how do we come to find ourselves in this embodied state? And so this verse gives us a hint. We find ourselves in this embodied state because we have this seed. I'm playing with the metaphor a little bit. Some seed, which is very mysterious and we're not going to get into, but the seed of our desire to enjoy separately from Krishna is planted and sprouts into this tree of our embodied identities. And so what is that seed planted into? It's planted into the ground of material nature, as Prabhupada translates here, or Prakriti. When we who are actually Purusha come in contact with Prakriti, we end up in this embodied state. So when we're in this embodied state, so that one tree planted in material nature, this verse goes on to explain two kinds of fruit come from this. So from our embodied selves as this tree, there are two types of fruit. And those two types of fruit are usually described in terms of dualities. Most often, the duality that's invoked is happiness and distress or sorrow, right? In the Gita and other texts, you see the words often used are sukha and dukkha. It helps that they rhyme. It's good to remember because they're actually very, in one sense, although in our ignorance, we think of them as being polar opposites of each other. Actually, they're two sides of the same coin because they're made of the same stuff. They're both the products of our engagement with the material world and our expectations of the material world. I know it sounds a little technical, but if we take a step back from it and we think about it, we kind of analyze in our own lives, we have this experience where if we're really honest with ourselves, so often we may make it seem very complicated and sophisticated in our lives and our occupations or our family lives or our pursuits in different ways. But if we're really honest and kind of introspect on it and really boil it down to its essence, so often everything boils down to this duality. isn't it? Everything boils down to we want to be happy, we don't want to be unhappy. We want to be successful, we have some fear or anxiety around failure. Right? We seek good health, and especially now we're more conscious of it than ever during, pandemics and health crises. But we want to try to avoid illness. So again and again, we find these dualities. In yoga philosophy, these dualities are said to be rooted in a kind of like a kind of archetypical, like proto duality, that in yoga philosophy, some of you may be familiar with this phrase, is called raga dvesha. Raga is usually translated as attachment or attraction. And dvesha is sometimes, it's usually translated as aversion. We can also understand it sometimes as a kind of a hatred. It could be fear as well. But the idea is there's a certain category of things that we're attracted to, or we're attached to, or we want to grasp or lean into. And there's the reverse of that, or the flip side of that there are those things that we're averse to, we have negative feelings towards. And we spend more or less our entire material lives classifying things consciously or unconsciously into these two categories, and then trying to get more of category A and trying to stay away from category B. So we'll come back to that, but that's really, really significant. And it is going to play a very significant role when we finally bring in Krishna and Krishna's sweetness into the equation. But for now, let's go back to the metaphor. So there's this one tree that's planted in the ground of material nature, and there are two kinds of fruit on this tree: the fruit of happiness and the fruit of suffering or distress. Now, where is this tree rooted? We talked about it being in the ground of the material nature. So there are three roots in this metaphor. And as you may remember from the translation, or as you may have guessed, those three roots are the three modes of material nature: sattva, rajas, and tamas, or goodness, passion, and ignorance, right? These three modes are what not only keep us bound in the material world, but they're really at the root of our connection to the material world. Just like roots are how the tree gets all of its kind of nourishment, and it grows through the roots absorbing the nutrients, right? So also our embodiment, our embodied state, we are, you can say, nourished, or we are filled with, we're influenced by these three modes always, at every time. According to the Gita, at every moment, there's this combined influence of the three modes. And at any one given moment, one predominates the others, right? So this is, I think, very familiar to most of us. But this is a framework to understand what is our actual condition as embodied beings in the material world. So there are three roots. These three roots are the three modes. Now, the fruits that we talked about, the fruits of sukha and dukkha, or raga and dvesha, of happiness and distress, or attachment and aversion, through those fruits, we experience four tastes. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, the four tastes that are being referred to are like salty, sweet, maybe sour, and bitter. I'm not sure, but I think those are the four tastes, in the sense of, in a physical sense. Here, it's a metaphor for these four, what is sometimes called the four objectives of human life, or we can say human life in the material world. In Sanskrit, they're called chatur purushartha, the four life goals, or goals of being human, of being purusha, being people. Religiosity, which is dharma, economic development, which is artha, sense gratification, which is kama, and liberation, which is moksha. And although we sometimes talk about these things in a negative sense, so for instance, the Bhagavatam in the first canto, we learn that the Bhagavatam transcends these four. And there's very strong words used for that, those texts, those religious texts, those shastra, those scriptures that are focused solely on helping us with these four, right? The Bhagavatam is said to transcend them, and those a system of religion that's all about these four things is called Kaitava Dharma, or kind of cheating religion. The idea, though, is not that these are necessarily bad things. It's part of what it means to be, a person, a human in the material world. But these four things need to be balanced. And ultimately, the first three, and Srila Prabhupada comments on this quite often, that the first three are ultimately meant to be in service of the fourth. That is to say, religiosity, some economic development, right? Kind of our financial and just like our livelihood, right? How do you survive in this world? There needs to be some sense of value, of worth, of economics, artha. Even sense gratifying kama, we are by nature, we're as embodied beings, we have a propensity for enjoyment. We have a propensity to experience pleasure. And so that, depending on our particular stage in life and occupation in life and our lifestyle, that's going to manifest and have to be regulated in different ways. But the idea is not that these need to be eliminated, but that they need to be regulated, and that ultimately they need to all be in service of moksha, or liberation. And from a bhakti standpoint, that's not just moksha in the impersonal sense of transcending the suffering of the material world, or transcending birth and death, but the ultimate liberation of going back home, back to Godhead, back to Krishna. So just as four tastes, just as to have a kind of a healthy diet, right? Like Ayurveda will talk about, you need to have balance with the different types of foods, different tastes. So, right, if you're just eating sweet, there's going to be something lacking, and you'll become out of balance, and it just won't even be a pleasurable experience. So even just as with our meals, we try to balance it. It's nice to have a little tiny bit of bitterness, maybe, or a little sour. Sweet and sour gives a combination. So in a similar way, the fruits of the bodily happiness, having these four tastes, the four tastes need to be balanced. And when they're imbalanced and when they're regulated, we experience actually good health, right? We experience sattva when when we're balanced and regulated and kind of appropriate in all of these four goals, even though they're in one sense material goals, we experience some real happiness and some real satisfaction because we're experiencing sattva. So these are the four tastes. The four tastes, the verse goes on to say, and everything in our embodied state is experienced through the five senses, right? So that brings us to five. So we're going through the numbers. So four tastes, five senses. And these five senses, right? What is it? Seeing, hearing, smelling. So yeah, hearing, seeing, smelling, touching. Which one am I missing? Eyes, ears, nose. Tasting, yes, of course, right. Thank you. Tongue, tasting, and then feeling, right, through the skin. So so these are the five senses for acquiring knowledge. And they occur in the midst of six circumstances. These are the six circumstances which are beyond our control, which happen to every embodied being. Lamentation, illusion, old age, death, hunger, and thirst. The verse goes on to say there are 7 layers of bark that cover the tree. So what are these 7 layers? What do the 7 represent? They represent our skin, our blood, our muscle, our fat, our bone, our marrow, and semen, right? These are the very kind of the physical things that make up our bodies. And it's really interesting, actually, because in one sense, right, we can think of these things as just being kind of very like dull, gross matter. But it's really astounding by Krishna's arrangement how complex we are as beings, that right, like any one of these substances has encoded in it so much about us, right? Just like there's DNA encoded in our blood or in the semen that practically speaking can, tell you so much about a person, about their physical makeup, their genetics. Right now, science has advanced to the point of being able to even decode from just the smallest sample, practically, DNA that's able to identify someone, down to like 1 out of, I don't know how many, like millions of people, right?
Here is Venkata Bhatta Prabhu's criminal justice career kicking in.
You mentioned it, so it's on my mind now. Right, but it's in one sense we can say, oh, that's just material stuff, but it's quite amazing, and it's quite astounding and humbling that we couldn't even imagine creating something ourselves that could be so intelligent, that's so just see, like, by the Krishna's arrangement. Ultimately, it's Krishna's hand behind everything, but how Krishna's created even our bodies, even in a biological or physiological sense, where we have these coverings, like the 7 layers of bark that have so much information encoded, even within them. So just really kind of an amazing thing. But going on, so there are these 7 layers of bark, and then going on to number 8, there are 8 branches of the tree. And what are those 8 branches? Those 8 branches are the gross and subtle elements. So we are made up of, in our body, embodied states, we are made up of these gross and subtle elements. Right? Of course, the gross elements are present in us in different ways through the senses, but also we can think about the different systems within the body. The digestive system is very much linked to fire. We talk about the fire of digestion. The circulatory system, right, is kind of a water-based system. Air and respiration. We have this really amazing system of expelling waste that is very much associated with the earth element. And we have this neurological system that is very is more subtle and is connected to the idea of space, the concept of space or ether. But in addition to that, we also, as part of our embodied state, we also have the mind, the manas, we have the discerning intellect or the buddhi, and we have the ahankar, or the ego, or the false ego. And so these are the 3 subtle elements. So altogether there are 8, and these are like the branches of the tree, right? This is how we sort of branch out and experience this embodied life. And then the tree has 9 hollows. These are the 9 holes of the body, right? The 2 eyes, the 2 ears, the 2 holes of the nostril, the mouth, the rectum, and the genitals. And then the 10 leaves, or the 10 life airs that pass through the body. So from 1 to 10, in this very poetic way, the Bhagavatam offers us this metaphor of understanding in detail the complexity of the body. But what is the point? And especially, what is it doing it's very interesting information. I hope it's interesting. I found it kind of interesting. I geek out on this a little bit. But what is the point, and what is it doing, particularly in the 10th canto, where we're supposed to really be diving deep into Krishna and Krishna's sweetness and Krishna's love for us and our love for Krishna? So all of this kind of extended metaphor is leading up to this last line in the translation, and that Srila Prabhupada unpacks more in the purport. And that is that in this tree, right, it's good to know about the tree, but what's really important is knowing that in the tree there are two birds who are sitting side by side. Dvikhaga. Who are those two birds? One is the Jivatma, the individual spirit soul. And the second, the other, is the Paramatma, or as this section of the Bhagavatam has been calling it, the Antarayami, or the super soul. These are the Dvikhaga, the two birds, the two, as Prabhupada expands on in the purport, the two living forces, the two living elements within this body, which is, again, compared more to the inanimate, right? So there's the two animate, which is the two birds, in the, we can say, inanimate tree. Now, tree is a living thing, but the idea is the tree is stationary, it's inanimate, but the birds are the animated living force within this whole kind of framework of the tree. And so I want to suggest to us in our just remaining time that there are three takeaways that we can really focus on when we look at this verse, right? All three of them, in one sense, bring us back to Krishna, or bring us to Krishna. The first is something that I hinted at a little bit earlier, and maybe in a few minutes when we open it up to some Q&A and discussion, we can hear some of you share some realizations, or if you have questions about this. But there is being suggested here a complexity. Complexity, it sometimes can be bewildering to us, and so we can hear a complex description like this, and we can become a little disturbed or bewildered. But complexity also awakens in us an appreciation. It evokes a kind of a humility or a sense of wonder. So, like in the 10th chapter, rather, of the Bhagavad Gita, which is the traditional name of it is Vibhuti Yoga, the yoga of the opulences of Krishna. What does Krishna do in the 10th chapter is he identifies himself with all of these amazing, wondrous opulences. And the idea is, or at least one idea is, that when we experience wonder, when we experience something really powerful or great or majestic in some ways, it humbles us. It brings us to a natural state of humility, not in a way that makes us feel bad, not humiliates us, but humbles us in the sense of it's an opportunity to appreciate how amazing is Krishna. And he says at the end of the 10th chapter, he says, this is but a spark of my splendor. And he even kind of playfully, not really chastises, but he kind of playfully dismisses this to Arjuna. He says, what need is there for all of this, right? Why get into all this technical, listing and enumerating of this, I am that, and of, of animals in the jungle, I'm the lion, or of aquatics, I'm the shark, right? He says, if we get on this, I'm paraphrasing, but Krishna says, there's no end to my glory. So if we go down this road, we'll never end. And Ananda Bihari Prabhu wants us to end at 7:45. So Krishna says, what need is there for so much detail, when even just, any opulence is just a tiny fragment of who I am. So just appreciating the complexity of this body, of what it means to be embodied, of going, through this list, understanding our connection to the modes, understanding, the way these different things work, these 8 elements, or these 7, bodily kind of pieces of construction that make up our physical, coverings of our body, and all of this stuff. In one sense, it's a lot of technical detail, but the point is, it should kind of humble us, and it help us to realize that what do we know? We don't even really fully understand our own bodies. How complex, how intelligent, how brilliant is Krishna, that he is able to create and maintain and we'll talk about this tomorrow, but he's able to create, maintain, and even annihilate, not just what to speak of one little body among billions and billions, but he's able to create, maintain, and annihilate universes upon universes filled with these bodies, right? So we're one tree that is so complex to us, and yet Krishna is behind it all, and is like effortlessly creating, maintaining, and annihilating. So it should, invoke or evoke some sense of humility, of wonder, of appreciation for our own complexity and for the complexity of our source, or the intelligence behind it, behind us. A second takeaway is one that Srila Prabhupada stresses towards the end of this purport, that we must understand the living force within the body. He says, he writes very powerfully, the modern civilization of ignorance is simply engaged in analyzing the body. And thus people come to the erroneous conclusion that the living force within the body is also material, right? But we have to understand the difference between the living force within and the material body. And we often talk about this as like, something that's very basic, like it's the ABCs of spiritual life. And of course, we all know the very first lesson, you are not this body, we're, spirit, soul. But to know it rhetorically and to know it on a deep, internalized, felt level are two different things. Right? We can easily say the words, oh, we're not this body, we're spiritual, but to actually understand, first of all, to appreciate the complexity of the body rather than to sort of just deny it and just, right? That itself is pretty difficult for us to do. It requires some real awareness and introspection. But then to go beyond that and to begin to realize and to reconnect with our identity like that bird in the tree. Srila Prabhupada would give another bird analogy, slightly different, but similar in some respects. And that is the bird in the cage, where if we have a bird and we keep it in, let's say, a golden cage, and we take very nice care of the cage, we clean the cage, we decorate the cage, we take great pains to beautify and ornament the cage, but we never feed the bird within or care for the bird within. It's a kind of madness, right? Because the whole point of the cage is for it to be a home for the bird, right? That doesn't mean we neglect the cage, right? So this is not a prescription to neglect the body, but we keep it in perspective. We maintain the cage so that it can serve its function of being a home for the bird. But our real energy should go towards, or the majority of our energy, we can say our priority should be caring for that bird. So also, we have to, as embodied beings, we have to engage with the body. We have to take care of the body. But ultimately, what is our priority? Our priority should be that bird within the cage, that what are the needs of the Atman? What is the needs of the spirit soul within? And the real ultimate takeaway of this verse, and why it's introduced, I would say, in the 10th canto, why does this come in the prayers of the demigods? The real key takeaway here is that we are not alone. That as spirit soul within the body, and it sounds almost mysterious and it sounds almost mystical, and it's a little difficult to explain to people sometimes because it's much easier to say, right? We all sort of, I think people from many different cultures and faith traditions, and right, even if someone's not maybe necessarily so religious or learned in scripture, it's easier to sort of understand conceptually that there is a body and there's a soul within the body, but to understand that there's actually two souls, we can say. There's the individual soul and there's the super soul. That's a radical idea. But that idea is what actually really brings us to the place of bhakti. Because not only are we called to care for the needs of the soul within, but we're actually, the whole idea is to awaken to the super soul within, is to realize that seated next to us as our very best friend, as our ever well-wisher, as the one who is caring for us like no one else, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, he is there and he's patiently waiting for us. So the way that the analogy goes, I know we're getting towards the end of the time, so I'll close on this, and then we can open it up to some questions. The way that the analogy of the two birds in one tree goes, which the Bhagavatam is actually just hinting at, right? So the Bhagavatam is taking this analogy and alluding to it, but it's actually found in other texts. It's actually found in some of the oldest Vedic texts in the in three Upanishads, in the Katha Upanishad, the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, and I think the Mundaka Upanishad. So it was an older analogy that would have already been known. But the way that the analogy goes is that there are two birds within one tree, and that one bird, the first bird, is totally preoccupied with those two fruits that we talked about, with tasting the sweet and with trying to avoid the bitter, right? In other words, with trying to maximize happiness and avoid suffering or sorrow. And that bird, that first bird, the Jivatma bird, has become so preoccupied, so obsessed, we might say, so fixated on just this game of figuring out. It's not a game to the bird. To the bird, it's everything. It's the ultimate reality. This activity of trying to get the sweet and avoiding the bitter fruits. So much so that this Jivatma bird has become totally illusioned, and has forgotten that its own beloved, its soulmate, right? And I like to think of these as lovebirds. Its lovebird soulmate is sitting next to it and is waiting patiently. And so who is that bird? That bird is the bird of Paramatma. That's the bird of Krishna, who waits patiently for the Jivatma to turn back, to willingly choose to reconnect with him. And in some traditions, it's said, who is very sweetly just singing a little song, a little bird song. So I like that idea because it reminds me of Krishna, like Muralidhar, playing the flute, just playing his flute, waiting for us to wake up and to realize, to hear it. It's not that Krishna is not playing the flute until we turn to him. He's playing the flute. That bird is singing, he's singing his song, just patiently waiting for that first bird to realize that what she's been looking for has been there the whole time. And that is Krishna, our ever well-wisher. So I'll close there, and we have about 10 minutes for some questions and comments, reflections, realizations. So I will open it up.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. There's a couple of things. One is, there's something that represented every number. One was for, I think, the body as the tree, right? Two was for duality, right?
It was, the two fruits. Yeah, the duality of the fruits.
So this, this word duality, it always kind of messes with my mind, because I think part of the reason is because it seems to mean different things in different contexts, Yeah. So today, though, I think you said that it's actually one thing, because this happiness and distress or attraction and aversion comes out of that one thing of the jiva coming in contact with material nature. Is it?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right.
I was also thinking that in another way, it's two sides of the same coin, because when you come in contact with material nature for the sake of happiness, it inevitably results in distress.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think I needed to like confirm that, because I'm always having a little bit of a challenge grappling with the fact that that's always true, because sometimes it seems like it's not true, because you can have something that like really does it for you for your whole life, right? But I guess the fact that even if you come into contact with something that gives you happiness your whole life, right? The fact that you will die, right?
Right. At the very least, we can say that it has an expiration date, or you have an expiration date. So it still falls short of that, that unending happiness that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other thing I want to add is, and thank you for this question. I hear you, Gail, in terms of, especially within our tradition, it gets complicated because you're right, these words are used in different ways. And so in the sense of our distinction from Krishna, we are a dualistic tradition. So that kind of duality for us is really important, that we never merge into or become one quantitatively with Krishna. So that's where, for us, duality becomes important. But the kind of duality that we're talking about here, or that this verse is talking about, or that you'll find, for instance, in the Bhagavad Gita, it's astounding. I haven't done a count, but it would be interesting if someone counts the number of times Krishna identifies in the Gita the need to rise above duality, or to be free of dualities, right? Duality is definitely a sort of a problem in the Gita. This kind of duality we're talking about is this sort of fixation on seeing like happiness and distress, success and failure, that very much is two sides of the same coin. And that from a bhakti standpoint, ultimately, our way of sort of rising above those dualities is to see that both are ultimately coming from Krishna. So even in a practical sense, right? Happiness, and like if I experience some temporary happiness, or I experience some temporary setback, as I grow in my bhakti, more and more I should be able to see Krishna's hand in either situation, or in both situations.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Both situations should be able to connect me deeper to Krishna. In my so-called successes or happiness, maybe I experience that through gratitude for Krishna, right? But I'm reminding myself, this is coming from Krishna. This is just a manifestation of Krishna in my life at this moment. And in my so-called failure or setback or suffering, as hard as it is, I should be able to connect that to Krishna. This is also coming from Krishna, right? This is here to teach me something, or what have you. So in that sense, ultimately, our notion of Advaita, of non-duality, of rising above dualities, is because everything is coming from our beloved Krishna.
Okay, and just to very quickly bring it back down to this gross level, the number 7 was the 7 things that our body was made up of, and I was just wondering if I missed any. I got semen, blood, mucus, skin, stool, urine, and was bile one of them?
So yeah, I've heard that said in this way. In this list is a little bit different. The way it shows up here, and I'm just reading off of this, is skin, blood, muscle, fat, bone, marrow, and semen.
Yeah. We can request our dear presenter to prepare some slides for tomorrow for that.
You want some visuals on that?
Oh,
yes.
No. It was muscle, fat, marrow, and then what come after marrow?
Sorry, I'm just going back to the semen is the last one.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you so much for.
Yeah, that's good. If you're ever on like Jeopardy or something and they ask that question, I'll put it in the chat box also.
Where did you get that from, that list?
That's in the verse itself.
Oh,
in the
okay,
translation of the verse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see Shikshastika Prabhu has a hand raised.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
I just wanted to make a comment on the 2 birds in the tree, and the concept, or the principle of happiness and distress and material duality. I used to read Ralph Waldo Emerson, of course, he was a Vedic scholar as well. He commented on the Bhagavad Gita, but he wrote an essay about karma, which is called Compensation. And he really solidifies this whole idea of how you can't get one without the other in the material world. You know, unless you're on the transcendental plane, you can't divide the happiness from the distress. He says, men seek to be great. They would have offices, wealth, power, and fame. They think that to be great is to possess one side of nature, the sweet, without the other side, the bitter. This dividing and detaching is steadily counteracted. Up to this day, it must be owned, no projector has had the smallest success. In other words, nobody in the history of mankind has ever been able to do that, to separate one from the other. Yeah. He says, the parted water reunites behind our hand. Pleasure is taken out of pleasant things, profit out of profitable things, power out of strong things. As soon as we seek to separate them from the whole, we can no more have things to get the sensual good by itself than we can get an inside that shall have no outside, or light without a shadow. And he closes by saying, quote, drive out nature with a fork, she comes running back, end quote.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I had not heard that before, and it just perfectly encapsulates and mirrors the problem of duality. Yeah, thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. So I think we have 2 minutes remaining. If anyone has anything further. Yes, Adi Purusha Prabhu.
Not sure if I can.
Oh, you're echoing quite. There's a lot of feedback.
You've got it. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hare Krishna.
Haribo.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, you made the point very clearly about how basically what's this doing here, and how the creation, the complexity of it, and the power of it, the extensiveness of it, leads us to the Creator, and how wonderful is Krishna, and therefore let's serve him. It's a pretty simple connecting the dots, and sometimes we get overwhelmed and lost in what they say, can't see the forest for the trees, and we get so the false ego, making ourselves and what we have to say more important than Krishna and other people. Like they say, a person is so full of himself that he has no love. It just becomes pride, egoism, me. And therefore, the loving exchanges dry up. And even the understanding of trying to give pleasure to Krishna becomes marginalized. So it's really nice the way you explained like that this is fantastic. And Krishna is fantastic. And therefore, this creation helps us to appreciate, use that word really nicely, helps us appreciate that Krishna loves us. That's why he did all this, to facilitate our material desires and to ultimately draw us back to the relationship that is our true satisfaction. Srila Prabhupada is so kind. Krishna sent Srila Prabhupada. Anyway, that's all. I'm just restating the obvious, what you already spoke about so nicely. We like to hear everybody's voice. Thank you for giving us time to contribute. Lord is to Prabhupada.
Would anyone else like to say anything? Okay, it's 8 o'clock. I guess we can close it. I know Venkata Prabhu has to make a hard stop. Right, Venkata Prabhu? We have a real job, real engagement. So Venkata Prabhu looks so young. Did you shave? Right? I was like, what's different about him today? So Venkata Prabhu, thank you very much. You are the king of analogies, king of metaphors. Thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you tomorrow. So everybody tune back in. We're going to have Venkata Prabhu with us tomorrow. Hemangi, thank you for your smile. Somebody, it's Bhima Prabhu. Bhima Prabhu is smiling, and the Vivasvan is lighting his bright face and beard and hat. Bhima Prabhu, we love you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Hare Krishna. Jamuna Jaya. Jamuna Jaya. Hare Krishna. Good to see you. Good to see everybody. Thank you.
Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada
Hare
ki
Krishna.
jai.
Hare Krishna.
Wonderful class.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.